So first of all, thank you so much for coming to the webinar and happy Almost Earth Day, which is tomorrow. So glad that you're with us this afternoon for this Kids Making Sense webinar on the quest for pollen, which is a free activity that we have available, and you can download it here at this bit.ly app. There should also have been a link in the registration page. If you have any issues finding it, feel free to shoot me an email. My email will appear in a couple of slides here. But today what I'm going to be doing is walking you through what the activity is, step by step, and then if you have any questions about certain aspects of it, I'm more than happy to answer those questions once we get to the question and answer session. Let me click through my next slide. Here we go. So before I jump into that material, I just want to introduce Kids Making Sense in case there are people who aren't as familiar with the program. The program itself was created by a team of air quality and atmospheric scientists who are really passionate about air pollution, meteorology, and climate change. And what the program is a science educational program with a curriculum and products that teach students how to measure air pollution using air quality sensors, teaches them how to interpret the data that they're collecting, and then how to take action to reduce the emissions and their own personal exposure to air pollution. And the program and its tools were really developed and refined over the course of about 8 years in collaboration with environmental agencies, teachers, community groups, etc. And so far it's been used in over 300 classrooms across the US and abroad. And if you want to find out more information, I've added the URL down here. You can go ahead and take a look. So our team, we're made up of scientists and educators and technical staff. And so today you'll be hearing from me, and I'm Olivia, the co-program manager and the lead of science for Kids Making Sense. Also an atmospheric scientist and a chemist by training. But also on our core team here, we have Will McCoy. He's the co-program manager and the program lead for education. Tim Blakey, who does all our awesome graphics, helps us with the marketing side of things as well. Bryant West, technical editing, and then Tammy Lobetza, who's our science advisor. Okay, so we'll jump into the agenda. So we'll go over what is the quest for pollen and how you can either use it yourself if you're a student or engage your class if you're a teacher. We'll go through some housekeeping. We'll go step by step through the activity like I mentioned. I'll discuss the upcoming virtual science poster session that we have. And then we can go through any questions that you might have about the activity or about Kids Making Sense. So just one housekeeping thing. So if you could use the Zoom Q&A feature to ask any questions that you might have, that should look something like this at the bottom of your screen. That would be really helpful. And then once we get to the Q&A section, I'll go through any questions that may have come up. That would be great. All right, so with that, we'll jump straight into the quest for pollen activity. So in this activity, students are going to be learning to answer the following questions. And hopefully you've had a chance to download the activity, but if you haven't, don't worry, I'll walk you through all the steps anyway. So the first question that they'll be answering is, first of all, what is pollen? What's its purpose? And what does it look like? They'll then learn about what particulate matter is and how pollen is a type of particulate matter. And then they'll answer the question, or have the information to answer the question, how can PM or particulate matter impact health and breathing? And in the more recent version of the document that's online, we have at the very last page the next generation science standards that are aligned with this activity or this lesson as well, in case that's useful for you teachers for implementing this in your classroom. And safety precautions. So as with any sort of activity of this nature, children should really be assisted by an adult. And if you happen to be uploading any sorts of, pictures of the pollen that you see or anything like that, students should, or children should ask an adult before they upload those to social media. So those are the two PSAs that I had to make there. Okay, so let's go into the actual activity. So what exactly is pollen? So pollen is a very fine powder. Um, if you've looked at a blossom tree recently, I know I'm suffering from allergies right now. At the center of those flowers or on the fuzzy cones that you might see on pine trees, that's pollen. And so the pollen that you see in this sort of a case is very concentrated, right? We can see it with our eyes. It makes it look like a powder or a clump, and that makes it really easy for us to see visually when we just go and look at a plant. But pollen is actually a very fine powder that trees, plants, and grasses and other vegetation release into the air to fertilize other plants. And if we look even closer at the powder, we can see that it's made up of individual grains or particles. And so each of these has a really interesting structure and a design that helps it to spread. And you can see some pictures here that I'm showing of some really high-powered microscope images of different types of pollen that exist out there. So you can see that they're all very varied. They serve different purposes, and that's the reason they look so different. So obviously, we're not going to be able to see this level of detail with our eyes, but we should be able to see some of the larger pollen particles or clumps that exist out there, which is what we'll be on the quest for. So once pollen grains are in the air, they're actually considered to be particulate matter and can travel through the air, and they can also be breathed in, just like any other type of particulate matter, so like smoke or dust, those sorts of things. So that might lead to the question, so what is particulate matter? Well, it's a tiny solid or a droplet that's suspended in the air. And so when I say tiny, I really do mean tiny. So we have to think in terms of micrometers. So if we look at this image here on the right, to put this into context, you can see this is the width of a human hair that I'm outlining with the mouse, and that's roughly 50 to 70 microns in diameter. Now, if we look at a pollen particle, that's considered to be a coarse particle, which is 10 micrometers or less in diameter. So you can see that this is just a fraction, a fifth to a seventh of a diameter of a hair in diameter. So these are really, really small particles. And some of the health effects of breathing in PM are going to be lung irritation and breathing issues, especially for people that suffer from asthma or breathing problems. So talking about pollen, pollen presents an additional issue as well, right? So as you know, there's many people, including myself, that suffer from hay fever or seasonal allergies. And so in addition to acting as a regular PM, particle in the air, pollen also presents this additional issue, which is people suffering from allergies and runny noses, sneezing, eye irritation, and other ailments from these types of particles. But it's important to keep in mind that pollen production and spreading of this type of pollen is a natural process, and it's a necessary process. So we don't want to stop pollen release into the air from plants and trees, but rather what we want to do is focus our attention on reducing our own exposure to this type of airborne pollen. So that's something that we will touch on at the end of the lesson. There's some points in there about how to lessen your own personal exposure. Okay, so in this activity, what you'll be doing is basically photographing or looking at using various different techniques, large pollen particles that may have settled onto the pollen catchers that we're going to be making, or that your students will be making. So the reason that we're looking at these larger ones is obviously because they're easier to see with the types of microscopes that we might have in the classroom, or ones that we can create at home. And we don't need those really high-powered microscopes to look at this. So the materials that you'll need are just regular index cards, and I have some of these items, which you can't see because I have my blurry screen on. Index cards, scissors or a hole punch. Hole punch really works best here. Clear tape, a cell phone with a camera, my magnifying glass, or a microscope. So one of those three things. A pen or a pencil, and then optionally some string if you have that available, or thread. Okay, So you'll be making these pollen catchers, which are going to be placed around in various locations to try and catch large pollen particles outdoors. So before you make the catchers, though, first what we want to do is actually plan where we would put them to actually capture some of this pollen. So the idea here is in the activity, students will list out 3 possible places that they might be able to place these pollen catchers to have the best chances of capturing some pollen. So this could be, in your yard, at school, in a community garden, perhaps in a school garden. You could consider putting them near different plants or trees that might produce different types of pollen. Some questions that might be helpful to sort of spur thought about where to put these are, are there trees or planters in your yard or on your street? Do you live near a park where there's trees and plants? Or, maybe at a community center. Additionally, so it's also possible that maybe some students don't have access to more than one type of tree or one type of plant. So in that case, that's not a problem. They could try placing cards at different distances away from the tree or the plant. And in that way, they could, do a little experiment where they're looking at how much pollen they're collecting at these different distances from that tree or that plant. So that's another way that you could do this activity. It's quite versatile. And so a tip here is that you really want to plan to put out at least 2 of these pollen catchers, but there's at least 2, but there's no maximum. So the more you put out there, the greater your chances are that you're going to, capture and be able to see some of this pollen that's so prevalent right now. Okay. So step 2, now that we've planned the locations of where the pollen catchers are going to go, we're actually going to make them. So what you need is 1 note card for each location, plus an additional note card, and that pollen catcher is going to be used to make a reference sample, which we'll talk about in a couple of slides. So the way this works is very straightforward. So you take one of your note cards. Let me see if I can actually hold this in front of me, sort of. You take one of your note cards, and you want to carefully hole punch a hole into the middle or into the side of the note card. You want to try and make the hole the same size on each card. So if you do use a hole punch, it makes it very straightforward to do that. If you plan to use a school microscope, or if you have a microscope at home and you're planning to use that to look at the pollen, you can actually cut the note card into strips of 25 millimeter width. And in that way, you've made sort of a microscope slide, and then you can go ahead and hole punch the hole into the middle of it. And in that way, it will fit nicely into the microscope slide holder. Okay, so once you've punched the hole into the card, you want to take a piece of tape very carefully, because you don't want to get any fingerprints onto the collection part of the tape, which is very easy to do. I do that all the time. But you want to carefully tape over the hole, as you see in this picture, so that the one side is sticky and obviously one side is the shiny side of the tape. And again, be careful not to touch the sticky side of the tape, because you'll get debris from your fingers on there, and it'll make it a bit harder to see some of the cool pollen that you might collect. What you want to do is basically repeat this for each of the note cards or slides for as many locations as you're planning to put these pollen catchers out for. All right, so now that you've made these pollen catchers, which are very straightforward to make, you want to go and set them up. So you want to take the newly made pollen catchers and place them outside in the locations that you had planned. Or if you're walking around and putting them in those locations and you happen to see somewhere else that you hadn't thought of, why not put another one there? It's very, very flexible activity, and you can, always make more of these little pollen catchers. Make sure that the sticky side of the tape is facing outwards, so that it's actually going to collect on the outside of the note card. So when you place each of the note cards outside, you also write the location of where you've placed them, so that when you collect them again, you know which one was which. And you might consider securing the pollen catcher with a rock or tape to prevent it from blowing over in the wind, So you can see that up here in the top image. I apologize for my cat crying in the background. You also might want to fold up the pollen catcher in half if you want it to stand up, if that helps you to get closer to a plant or a tree. Or you could use string, like in this lower picture here, to hang the pollen catcher from a branch or some other surface. Just make sure that when it's swinging in the wind, it won't hit something, because that might also cause debris to stick to the tape. And you might want to leave the catchers outside it's really going to depend on sort of the location you're in, the time of year it is, but you could start with something like 30 minutes, and then you could go back outside and perhaps, check on them, see what they look like visually, and then perhaps put them outside for another 30 minutes. That was my cat. She's very excited about pollen catching. But the ideal length of time of putting these outside is really going to depend on many things, like how windy it is, how much pollen's on the plants nearby, things like that. Okay, so now we've created all these pollen catchers and they're outside. You have one more pollen catcher left, and that one's going to be for creating a reference sample. And the idea behind this is you want to be able to create a reference and collect it and look at that so that you know what actual pollen looks like when you go to look at your other pollen catchers that are out there. So the idea here is you take the card that you've set up and you want to go and find a tree or a flower that has pollen, and then you want to carefully tap or lightly shake or even lightly touch the flower so that some pollen sprinkles onto the pollen catcher. And then what you can do is you can put that note card into a Ziploc bag, or you can take another piece of tape and sandwich it on top so that you're sort of sandwiching the pollen in between the two pieces of tape, if that makes sense. And the idea there is to stop you from, if you were to put that note card in your backpack or in your pocket, it could pick up dust and crumbs and all sorts of things. So, trying to seal it to maintain the integrity of that pollen that you just created or collected. And this is just a reminder that the pollen that you collect, remember, is going to be much larger than the pollen or larger or more concentrated than the pollen you might collect from the air. So when you're looking at the reference sample, keep in mind that's going to be a lot more obvious that it's pollen than it might look on some of the other pollen catchers that you placed around. Okay, so step 5, now we've collected all of the pollen, we've brought all the cards back inside. You'll want to now investigate what the samples look like. This is the interesting and exciting part, right? So there are a few methods that you could use to look at the samples that you collected. So the first one is you could use a magnifying glass, if you have access to one of those, or a student microscope, if there's one of those at home or in a classroom or a community center nearby. You could also use a cell phone camera, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a second. Or you could simply use your eyes. If you don't have access to any of these, using your eyes is also completely acceptable. It might be a bit harder to see though. One thing that'll make it a bit easier to see, having said that, is if you place a piece of white or black paper behind the pollen catcher when you're trying to look at the particles, that'll help them stand out more to your eye. So that might be something that's worth giving a try. Okay, so this is going to be our little detour here of how to convert your cell phone into a microscope. And so the idea here is that this is going to improve your ability to investigate pollen, or really any particles if you were trying to collect something else. So this is a very straightforward and hopefully simple way that you can enhance your viewing power. And as I should also point out, actually, there's lots of ways that you can use your cell phone and increase the magnification on it. And there's, a slew of these that are on the internet, YouTube, all sorts of places. But this is just one way that we thought worked well, especially for this activity. And so all you need for this actually is your cell phone that has a camera on it, a hairpin, and a laser pointer lens. So you might have I have a cat laser pointer. Here we go. Cat laser pointer, old one that doesn't work anymore. And so you could use one of those. So let's see. Sorry, next. Here we go. So with help from an adult, if you're a student here, so what you want to do is unscrew and remove the lens from the laser pointer. And the way that I like to do this first is you unscrew it from the battery end and you take the batteries out first. And in that way, you can't accidentally, like shine the light in somebody's eye or anything like that. So take the batteries out first and then unscrew the other end where the laser light usually comes out. And that will very easily come apart, and it will allow you to take out the tiny lens, which looks something like this. You then want to get a hairpin like you just saw, and basically use it as a pair of tweezers to hold this little plastic lens. Then you can take a piece of tape, or in my case, I used a piece of just sticky tack, and you can position it right over your cell phone camera lens on the back, like this. And you might have to adjust sort of how close it sits, how far away it sits, which side of the lens. So you could use, either side of it. One might work better than the other one at sort of focusing. There's a couple of ways you can play around with it, but it's overall very, very straightforward to put together if you have access to one of these lenses. But like I said, there's also other ways. If you don't have access to one of those, there's many other descriptions online of how to take something that you might have lying around the house to improve your cell phone. Okay. So you can use that as one of the ways to investigate the pollen. So once you've looked at each of your samples, there's this table in the activity lesson guide. And so you can fill this table out. So the idea is that you start with the reference sample and you look at it using the method that you've chosen. So maybe that's the cell phone microscope. You want to look closely at it and you want to write down, what do you notice about it? How would you describe it? Is the pollen a certain shape or color? And you want to do the same thing for each of the pollen catchers that you've placed outside. And so just keep in mind, remember the reference one is going to be much more concentrated than the other catchers that you've put out in various places. So in this table, you'll write down the location of each of the pollen catchers. You'll count the number of pollen particles that you can identify as being pollen. Remember, they might look yellow, they might look orange, they might be another color based on the tree or the plant that you had put them close to. You also want to write down the amount of time that each of the pollen catchers was outside. So it's possible that you left some out longer than others, but you just want to make sure you note that down. Then in the observation column, that's where you would write down something that you notice about the pollen. So like I mentioned before, the color, the amount, you might see other types of particles that aren't pollen, but are also interesting, and you might want to note those down as well. If you could see any sort of information on the shape of the pollen particles, that would also be an important observation to note. And so now what you have from your table is the number of particles that you collected on each of the catches. And then you also have the amount of time that the pollen catcher was left outside. And so what you can do is calculate the collection rate of each of these pollen catchers. So in other words, that's the number of pollen particles landing on your catcher per minute. So that's a calculation that's also outlined in the activity booklet. So collection rate, so you'll write down the number of particles on the catcher, the number of minutes that the catcher was outside, and then you can divide those two to get the collection rate, which is the number of particles that were collected per minute. And this is very similar to the way that we in science also talk about collection rate. That's something very common that we talk about, especially when we're collecting particles onto filters. So this is an important calculation in air quality science world. And you can do this calculation for each of the pollen catchers, and then you could even compare the collection rate of each of those catches. And maybe you could even come up with ideas as to why they might have different collection rates. Could be where they were located, could be the type of plant that they were put next to. That could also be a place of discussion. Once you've done that, that calculation, the last step is to really interpret the results and determine where you collected the most pollen, and then why that might be the case. So sort of what I was mentioning before. So where was the collection rate the highest? Why was that the case? And then something else that we also do so frequently in science is sort of think back to what you had just done and think of ways that you might be able to improve your experiment in the future. If you were to repeat this, what would you do? If you were looking to collect more pollen, would you move the pollen catches to a different location? Would you choose a different day? Would you choose a different time of day, maybe one that's windier, less windy? And why would you make those changes? So sort of trying to think through optimizing collection. And I believe, right, the last slide here. So then the lesson ends with sort of thinking about ways to take action, right? That's always something that's within our control. So now that everyone's investigated pollen in the neighborhood or at school, can think about ways to reduce your own exposure to it. And so the first one that we've outlined is limiting time spent outdoors when the pollen levels outside are the highest. And so there's places that you can go to check that. Sometimes they announce it on the local weather forecast, but you could also check the internet to see when pollen levels are very high. They'll also let you know what kinds of pollen are the highest. So if you happen to know which kinds you're most sensitive to or most allergic to, you could use that information to help you make decisions about when to go outside. Another suggestion is to run an air filter inside your home to help reduce the pollen or the particle levels that are inside. And if you do have to be outside, which sometimes, there's no way around it, we do have to be outside sometimes, and the pollen levels are very high, you could consider wearing a pollen mask or an N95 mask if you have access to one of those, because those will help filter out the particles in the size range that pollen exists. But there's obviously, these are only a few ways, so there might be many more that you could think of. And so sort of thinking through those and thinking about the ones that might work best for you is an important task. And with that, so that was a very quick run through of the Quest for Pollen, but I also wanted to mention that we have a virtual air quality science fair coming up. And so what this is an opportunity for you and your students to submit a science poster to us. So if your students run an experiment and create a science poster, you can submit it to us between May 3rd and May 24th. And we'll upload it to our website to showcase these posters that your students have made. And so they can actually use the Quest for Pollen experiment as their entry if they work up the results into the poster using the template that we have available. Also, if you were here for our Hunt for Dust activity that we've also had posted, you could also use that one. They're all, or if you have another experiment that's related to air quality that students have done or will be doing, you're more than free to submit that one as well. There'll be a judging during the last week of May, and the winners will be announced on June 4th. And so we'll be posting more information and updates on our news page on the website, which is listed right up here. So if you have, keep an eye out there for more information. If you have immediate questions about this, you can email Will. He's the contact for this. And so his email is listed here. I didn't mention, but I will. I'll send out these slides to everyone, so you'll have all the URLs and the links and the email addresses. And so we also, I've also included the template for the poster, which basically looks like this one here that I'm showing here, except it obviously doesn't have the text filled in, but it has the sections, it has information on what to put in each of the sections, step-by-step instructions of sort of how students can easily fill this sort of a poster template out. And possibly the most exciting part, especially for kids, is the winning poster will win cash prizes. So that's pretty exciting. Okay, and also if you aren't already, feel free to follow us on social media through any of the platforms. We post project ideas, we talk about the webinars that are upcoming, we'll talk about the virtual science fair, we post sample data, project ideas, information on how to link current events that might be happening out in the real world to kids making sense activities or the kits that you might have, and information on future opportunities as well. So feel free to follow us there. And with that, this is a shorter webinar than our longer ones that we've had in the past, but hopefully you've all gotten some good information about the quest for pollen from this. I've also included again where you can download the materials or the lesson plan itself. And if you have any questions, you can also feel free to email me here. But with that, I am going to look at the Q&A. If anyone has any questions, I'm going to open that now. And I'll be more than happy to answer any of them. Give you guys a couple minutes to filter them in if there are any. And if there aren't, that's also completely fine. Or if any come up later, definitely just shoot me an email. Pretty quick to respond. So. If not, maybe things were straightforward, which is great. All right, well, if there's no questions, then we can go ahead and close out. But if any come up, like I said, please send me an email. More than happy to help out or answer questions about kids making sense or this lesson or anything really. So yeah, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it that you took the time to learn more about our lesson. And I hopefully will see you next time for our next webinar, which will be in May. So thank you so much.